Well, I'd like to just add my own welcome and agree. I think that you're in for a treat if you're over 50, if you love someone who's over 50, or if you hope to be over 50 one day yourself. I think that kind of includes all of us. And I'm happy to be a very small part of the evening's proceedings to introduce Sarah and to make a few remarks at the end after she speaks, and then open things up so we can just have a free flow of conversation between Sarah and you. Anyone who knows how to Google or read her book jacket can find the public material that you would expect in an introduction, at this moment. You know that Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot is a sociologist and the Emily Hargroves Fisher Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the author of 9 books, and the recipient of the coveted MacArthur Prize, which brands you a publicly recognized genius, whether you want to be or not. Now, anyone could do that. Let me tell you, what you won't find on Google, and the kinds of things that you learn if you've had the privileges I have of being a colleague of Sarah's for over 30 years. To me, Sarah is a kind of genius, and I think that her genius consists in the unusual convergence and development of 3 very special gifts. The first of these, to me, is aesthetic. And here I'm not referring to the fact that I do feel that I've been treated to a 30-year-long fashion display of the most beautiful and versatile collection of clothes in the royal purple hues. I didn't even ask her what she was going to wear this evening, but you see, it confirms exactly what I said. But that isn't really what I mean by her aesthetic sensibility. I'm actually referring to her relationship to language. Sad to say, most social scientists regard the written word as a necessary inconvenience, something you have to kind of put up with in order to get across what it is you are trying to say. Sarah does not. Words to her are like the artist's pigments, and she crafts their relationship to each other to make something beautiful. When she writes a book, or she drafts a report to the senior faculty, or she composes a robing talk for a graduating student, of which I see there are many here in the room, we all derive the benefits of her aesthetic gift. The second gift is analytic. That it has seemed to me, watching Sarah for a generation, that she can't help herself, actually. She's a true teacher to her bones. She wants a deeper understanding of whatever she's considering, and she wants to help you see more deeply, too. Students often call her demanding in her teaching. In her writing and her teaching, she won't let you be a passive observer. She makes you aware that observing is itself a kind of composing, and she wants you to see beneath the surface. She wants you to join her there. She wants you to take her there with you. The third gift is ethical. For 30 years, I've watched Sarah raise the tough questions that direct us back to issues of fairness, to who's being included, to who's being left out, calls to remind us of our bigger purposes, possibilities, and responsibilities. And I think these 3 gifts, the aesthetic, the analytic, and the ethical, really undergird her original social science methodology, which she calls portraiture, the most recent result of which is her new book, the 3rd chapter, Passion, Risk, and Adventure in the 25 Years After 50. I give you my colleague, Sarah Lawrence-Lightfoot.
Thank you. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Yes? It's so wonderful to see all of you. So those of you who know me know that context means everything. I'm an anthropologist at heart, and so I had begged that this event take place up in my favorite room in the place, which is the Elliott Lyman Room. And because so many of you came, we had to come down here, and that's the greatest end point of all of this. But also I want to thank Bob Keegan for that beautiful introduction. I am a connoisseur of ritual, and I'm a connoisseur of introductions, and that's one of the most beautiful I've ever heard. I really wanted to meet this person. But since I'm dressed in purple, I stand here ready to go. My friend Jacob, an ardent intellectual and distinguished journalist with a PhD in political science, has a quick mind and a subtle wit. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only son of Jewish immigrant parents, he is a man of expansive warmth, whose greatest pleasures are relational and social, and whose currency of discourse has always been language, a rapid-fire delivery blending a New York Bronx dialect with a sprinkling of Yiddish for emotional effect. Now 62, he tells me of his first experience attending a 7-day silent retreat where, after much resistance, fear, and panic, then resolve and determination, he began to let down his barriers and inhibitions and learn to live in the stillness. This still raw understanding and practice of meditation has opened a whole new discipline and perspective that seemed to challenge old inhibitions and raise questions about who he is becoming and about his capacity to be alone with himself. He says dramatically, meditation is the most counterintuitive thing I could have possibly tried to learn to do. And there is Robert, the 72-year-old retired mechanical engineer who I meet at an ice cream joint on the side of the road in rural New Hampshire. He and his wife of 50 years are out on their ritual Sunday drive, and they are looking to pick up an interesting conversation with a stranger. They sit down next to me at the picnic table and begin in a place where we all meet, with family stories. I listen to their proud tales about their grandchildren scattered all over the country and admire the photographs of their smiling faces. But soon, with a bit of gentle prodding from his wife, Abby, the conversation turns to Robert's new passion, and he goes to the car to fetch his drawings, postcard-sized pen and ink sketches of birds. He has always loved birds, listening to their songs in the morning light, watching them visit the bird feeders outside his kitchen window, observing the social interactions among them. And he has always said, I wish I had an artistic bone in my body so I could draw the beauty I see in them. A week after his retirement party, as he faced the surprising emptiness in front of him, he took the leap of faith and signed up for 3 drawing courses, what he called a total immersion, at the Adult Education Center. This has become my life, he says in confessional tones, as I remark on the steady improvement I see in his portfolio of work, and as he talks about the exhilaration and vulnerability of learning something new. It was because of scores of ordinary, everyday encounters like these with people who were risking the unknown, embarking on new learning, and re-envisioning their lives, with people whose voices held a mixture of passion, anxiety, and secrecy, that I followed my curiosity and embarked on a 3-year research project of inquiry, witness, and storytelling, interviewing and observing 40 women and men across the country, a journey that culminated in my book, The Third Chapter, Passion, Risk, and Adventure in the 25 Years After 50. My book focuses on the creative and purposeful learning that goes on between 50 and 75, the chapter that follows young adulthood and middle age. It asks, what are our sources of inspiration? What are our greatest fears and inhibitions? What are our major barriers to learning? And what allows us to pursue new adventures? How are the processes of learning, adaptation, experimentation, and mastery different during this period of life? Do maturity and life experiences support a greater sense of liberation and collaboration, a new level of patience, perspective-taking, and confidence, and a sturdy sense of self that permits risk-taking? How do we hang on to our dignity, our sense of authority, and self-respect when the awkwardness and imbalance of new learning makes us feel infantilized? How do we balance and negotiate the tensions between the losses and gains of new commitments? What are some of the things that we in our third chapters discover that we can't learn? And finally, what are the connections that can be drawn between individual learning, cultural creativity, and community building? What institutional innovations, shifts in cultural priorities, and educational reforms might support the translations from individual gain to public good? A look at the recent census figures begins to tell the story of the emerging voices, visibility, and vitality of the promise and prominence of those of us in our third chapters. 10,000 baby boomers turn 60 every day, and we are healthier, better educated, and yearning for a productive and enjoyable alternative to retirement. The arc of life and learning is continually being expanded and redefined. Not only are people living longer, but demographers tell us that the third chapter represents a new and definitive developmental period in our culture, one that comes around only once a century. Last century, for example, we discovered and labeled adolescence as a distinct developmental period between childhood and adulthood. We began to see it as a time of enormous change, drama, and fluctuation, as an explanation of new alignments in the strained relationships between parents and their teenagers, as the initial treacherous steps towards independence and self-definition. Adolescence became a cultural construct that was stamped into our psyches and written into the social scripts of our families, our schools, and our communities. This century is ours, and notice I'm in the pronoun, ours. We are forging a new and distinctive chapter in life. Those of us between 50 and 75, those of us who are neither young nor old, are beginning to redefine our views about the casualties and opportunities of aging. We are challenging cultural definitions of strength, maturity, power, and sexiness. This is a chapter in life when the traditional norms, rules, and rituals of our career seem less encompassing and less restrictive, when we are embracing new challenges and searching for greater meaning in life. The boomer generation, once defined by our youthful boldness, our bravado, our achievements, and our opportunism, bring to the third chapter our resources, fewer than before. Our social capital and sense of authority, our appetite for new learning and lives of service, our yearning for inspiration and adventure. It turns out that reinvention in the third chapter is filled with poignant paradoxes. We experience the twin sensations of loss and liberation, constancy and change, urgency and patience, hard work and raucous play. The process of learning something new feels both familiar and strange, exciting and terrifying, mature and childlike, both in character and out of body, like returning home and setting out on an adventure to an unknown destination. This is true whether we are talking about learning a new skill, craft, or art form, like learning to speak a foreign language, play the jazz piano, or become a playwright, or whether we are learning to feel or express a broader and deeper emotional repertoire, freeing us from the bondage of the rigid requirements of decorum forged in our childhood, or whether we are learning to grieve after the death of a loved one, learning to make ourselves vulnerable and not retreat from intimacy, or whether we are talking about shifting the focus of our energies and priorities from solitary, individualistic, and competitive to community-based and collaborative, from making it up the ladder of success to making an imprint on the lives of others. One of the central paradoxes that I explore in my book, the one that I think resonates most deeply with this moment in our country's history and with our individual and collective quests, I call looking back and giving forward. Looking back and giving forward. Giving forward, making a difference, leaving a legacy, holding each of us accountable to something larger than ourselves. These impulses in us echo the clarion call of our new president, Barack Obama, whose rhetoric in this time of economic decline and high anxiety deftly balances an emotional and behavioral counterpoint of sacrifice and generosity, scarcity and accountability, patience and urgency. And besides, I had to mention Barack Obama in my speech. Very smooth. The impulses in us also echo the framework forged by developmental psychologist Erik Erikson more than a half a century ago, when he articulated 8 developmental stages across the life course, each one defined by a tension between constancy and change, progression and regression. The penultimate stage, and the one that resonates most closely with those of us in our 3rd chapters, Erikson calls generativity versus stagnation. Generativity, a kind of giving forward, is the productive and creative work of our 3rd chapters. It underscores our impulse to nurture and guide the next generations, an engagement that includes teaching, mentoring, writing, and innovation, artistic expression, activism, and advocacy. The harsh alternative is stagnation. It turns out that we in our 3rd chapters are able to tolerate the imbalance, risk-taking, and vulnerabilities of choosing change over constancy, of leaving the old and entering the new, when we can begin to picture, then compose and narrate our new life. Ironically, the pictures that we construct are often shaped and shaded by a return to our childhoods, to the values and rituals into which we were socialized in our families of origin, to the historical and cultural moments in which we were embedded. We look to our origins, to the lessons we learned at home about service, charity, justice, about collective responsibility and citizenship, and feel, often for the first time, compelled to find a way to enact those values and those principles. Or some of us do the opposite. We look toward home and decide that we do not want to carry on our parents' legacy. We do not want to be burdened or constrained by their values, ideologies, and teachings. Our 3rd chapters, in fact, resist the call of home. However we heed the call, through embrace or dissent or some ambivalent middle ground, by this stage in our lives, we are likely to have accumulated a rich array of experiences, wisdom, and skills that we are yearning to use wisely and well. Over the years, we have honed our expertise, identified our gifts, and we have learned how we learn. What seems to surge up in us like a compelling imperative is the wish to give forward, to be useful, and to make an imprint. In the 3rd chapter, we want to turn the tables, rewrite our priorities, reinvest in our relationships, recalibrate the meaning of success, even re-envision the concept of work. I use the term giving forward rather than the more typical notion of giving back as a way of reflecting how we in our 3rd chapters must develop ways of engagement and service that point toward the future, not get stuck in the anachronisms and nostalgia of the past. In order to be useful, we must respond to the contemporary context and envision a future into which our altruism might make a contribution. We need to listen to the voices and views of our children and our children's children, an intergenerational discourse that offers clues about how we might serve and be useful. Looking back honors the wisdom and weight of our ancestry. Giving forward is futuristic and transformational, enriching and enlarging those who give and those who receive. Philosopher Frederick Breutner captures the mutual gain and the real meaning of the word charity a benevolence and generosity that gives forward and circles back. He says, and I quote, "Your vocation is that place where your deep gladness meets the world's great hunger." Your vocation is that place where your deep gladness meets the world's great hunger. So here are two stories, both local and modest, and beautiful and earth-shaking, both about the taking of small, courageous steps deeper and deeper into the world. The first about teaching astronomy, and the second about discovering our voices. Both narratives resonate with the powerful dialectic of looking backwards into the future. And I'm going to hydrate myself because we in our third chapters know that's important. The first, a story about teaching astronomy. Roma Wolf, a 57-year-old physicist who has spent all of her professional career in the laboratory, enjoying the quiet and order of the space, the exacting familiar rituals of the scientific process, and the pursuit of the objective quantitative evidence, recently began to feel, after 30 years, the limits and constraints of her existence. The solitude and discipline of her work that used to feel safe and generative started to feel claustrophobic. The rituals began to seem routine. The questions that used to inspire curiosity began to strike her as dull and formulaic. But mostly she sensed the need to, as she put it, make a difference on our planet. In a more direct and a more immediate way, she yearned to teach, to serve, to give forward. Cutting back on her hours in the lab, Roma signed up for a mentoring program where she teaches middle school black, brown, and poor students in an after-school program the subject which always fascinated her the most when she was a young adolescent, astronomy. In her first year of teaching, Roma admits that this is the hardest, most challenging work that she has ever done, learning the science now long forgotten and finding a palatable and relevant way to present it, learning to relate to and discipline the children and capture their imaginations, learning to recover from the awkwardness and public failures that come with being a total novice. "I'm so completely uncool," she says with a smile. But harder still is what she calls venturing forth into places formerly forbidden, places she used to consider ominous and dangerous. Even though she has lived in Chicago for the past 30 years, first as a graduate student, then as a research professor, Roma had never traveled far from the shadows of the university. She had never even dared to drive through the mean streets of the West Side with their car doors locked. Never ever had a real conversation with an adolescent. She is single and without children of her own. Never experienced being a token white person in a crowd of black folks. Never felt so far outside of her element. These were all new experiences that felt both exhilarating and terrifying to her. The most difficult part of venturing forth, she claims, was losing her fear, being willing to face the unknown, and ridding herself of the deeply ingrained prejudices which had contained her life and restricted her movements. Now, after almost a year of working with the kids, after months of awkwardness and many missteps, she has begun to feel a little bit more comfortable, a little less foreign, and a lot less afraid. Now, when Roma teaches them astronomy, the subject that she loved the most when she was their age, she looks into their faces and occasionally she recognizes herself. She can begin to see in them the curiosity and eagerness that she once felt. "The kid in me has been sparked," she exclaims, looking amazed at the familiar sight she sees in this still strange place that has begun to feel like home. The second story is about discovering our voices. Sometimes the journey home requires that people confront the ancient traumas of their childhood. People in their third chapters find that they do not want to live any longer with the hurts, the remorse, the guilt connected to their childhoods. Going home, metaphorically, psychologically, literally, spiritually, to face the old impediments becomes a way of moving forward with their lives, and it requires courage, resolve, patience, and new learning. Occasionally, my interviewees discovered the source and site of their early injuries in the course of our conversations together. All of a sudden, in the retelling of a story they had told many times before, they would stumble upon a detail, a metaphor, a sign, or a symbol that would unlock feelings that would open up a floodgate of tears. Or they would begin to replay an experience from their childhood, say a conversation with a parent or a teacher, that they had always seen as positive and uplifting, and discover the dark underbelly, a reinterpretation of a practiced story that would suddenly bring forth the pain from the long-ago injury. Stephen Fox had this kind of surprising revelation when I interviewed him. At 67, Stephen is a public health doctor who has spent his professional life doing epidemiological research in the lab and working in rural regions of West Africa to eradicate malaria. Before going to medical school, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone, an experience which etched in him a lifelong commitment to international relief work. From an upper-middle-class African-American family, he has lived his life simply and with great humility, working behind the scenes to fight disease and oppression all over the world, always joining his professional engagement and expertise with his personal and moral commitments. He believes in thinking and acting globally and locally. In a decision that snuck up on him, Stephen decided to sign up for voice lessons at the local community music school. This was a radical departure from his workaholic life, which had never left him the time or space to pursue pleasurable avocations, never left him any time to play. As he began to recount to me the story from his childhood that motivated his new passion for singing, what he calls the big adventure of my third chapter, he discovered the subtle hurt carried in his mother's glance one Sunday afternoon when he was about 6. Stephen's favorite memory of early childhood is sitting on his mother's lap, listening to the radio when the Metropolitan Opera broadcasted their weekly performances. He had an immediate love affair with opera and begged his mother to take voice lessons. She did not refuse him permission, but there was something in her eyes, a subtle dismissiveness that made Stephen withdraw his request. Somehow she made me feel like opera singing was something for sissies, he recalls sadly. Then when Stephen became a young adult, he himself decided that opera was too frivolous and aristocratic for someone who was devoting his life to changing the world. But a few years ago, he decided that he had denied himself long enough, and he secretly began to take voice lessons. This was the hardest, most exciting work I've ever done, simply thrilling. He says about his first year of study, in which he never produced a note that even vaguely resembled the luscious tones that he had heard across the airwaves 60 years before. The sound does not matter to Stephen, however. What matters is the chance he now has to live his dream that is, as he calls it, the big turn on, and the high that comes with, as he puts it, a freedom that he has never known when he sings. What began as a benign and gentle story about being wrapped in his mother's arms, listening to opera, in the retelling during our interview, turns into a painful encounter with her disapproval of him. His tears catch up with him as he traces the connections between his recognition of the injury and his opportunity in the third chapter to heal the hurt with his voice. And one final surprise, an epiphany really, that Stephen discovers in the retelling of this ancient tale. He begins to recognize that learning to sing, learning to breathe from his diaphragm, learning to use his body as a sound channel, has somehow migrated into his work in public health. He feels he is a better, stronger, more authoritative, more empathic doctor now that he has liberated his voice. His giving forward in West Africa is becoming his beautiful, heartfelt aria. These two stories of Roma and Stephen begin to weave the tapestry of collective wisdom that I gathered from the 40 women and men whose new learning and giving forward I was privileged to witness. This evening, because, as Bob Keegan said, I'm always the teacher, I want to conclude my talk with 4 large meta lessons on education because we're here. On intergenerational relationships, on crossing boundaries, and on imagery and innovation. So the first lesson is on schooling and learning. New learning and giving forward in the 3rd chapter will require us to rethink the purposes, structures, and boundaries of schooling in our society. As I listened to the narratives of my interviewees, I was struck by the contrasts and contradictions that they drew between their formal education, from elementary school through college and graduate training, and the motivations and challenges of their learning and service as older adults. The very attitudes and aptitudes that had made them stand out and excel in school, competition, speed, caution, singular ambition, seem to be barriers to the risk-taking, collaboration, patience, and adventurousness that allowed them to embark on new learning 30 or 40 years later. They must unlearn old school habits. As one protagonist put it, my new learning feels completely oppositional, deeply at odds with the way I made it to the top in school. An industrial engineer reinventing himself as a sculptor, he claims that he has had to replace secrecy with openness, speed with deliberateness, and public rewards with a private vigilance. Others talked about having to shed the negative and pejorative labels bestowed upon them wittingly or unwittingly by teachers who saw them as lazy or stupid or unmotivated. Labels and prophecies which had left deep scars. New learning in their 3rd chapters required that they confront the ancient wounds, recover their dignity, and rise to the challenge of rediscovering their gifts. As an educator who has spent the last 35 years of my life studying the culture and character of schools and the trajectories of human development and learning, I have for a long time worried about the disjunctures and contradictions that so often exist between in-school and out-of-school learning, between the curricular and norms of classrooms and what we need to know and believe about ourselves in order to cope and thrive in the world. I have also spent a good deal of time lamenting the large proportion of children in our schools who are scarred intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, and who bear those injuries well into adulthood and old age. But my research for this book punctuated for me the myopia and short-sightedness of educational policies and practices in a narrowing environment of standards and standardization that do not anticipate the long trajectory of learning across the life cycle. I now believe that the designers of childhood education need to reconsider the developmental tasks of adulthood and old age, as well as those of childhood, when they begin to design institutional structures, construct curricula, and develop effective pedagogies. Using an architectural metaphor, Sociologist and lifespan theorist Orville Brim warns, quote, "To study childhood without its lifelong aftermath is to pour a foundation and neglect the edifice." More hydration. My second lesson is on intergenerational relationships. Not only do we need to redesign our schools to honor the central dynamic of continuity and change across the life cycle, we also need to reduce the generational segregation and the perception of generational competition and territoriality between the young and the old that permeates our society. The movement across school community boundaries needs to flow in two directions. Children preparing to live as citizens in an increasingly complex, diverse global reality need to be offered opportunities for apprenticeship and service in the real world. And people in their third chapters need to be seen as valued mentors who bring with them not only the accumulated knowledge of work and career, but also our wisdom, experience, and sense of perspective. The crossing of boundaries for both generations needs to express a respectful reciprocity, a dynamic pedagogy in which young and old are both teachers and learners. In order for a culture to flourish, younger people need the stories of older adults living among them. Likewise, the composing of our third chapters, narratives, helps each of us identify and express our own creativity, generativity, generosity, and service. This was certainly the case as I listened to third chapter learners who discovered, while they told me their stories, new insights into their own motivations and capacities, and a new sense of control and agency over their actions. Their stories became their anchor. Their stories became their compass. And my third lesson is on crossing boundaries. Are you with me? Good. Those people who are courageous and generous enough to risk crossing boundaries into the unknown in their efforts to give forward, whether they are navigating the borders of race, class, gender, generation, or geography, seem to follow similar steps on their journeys. The first step is curiosity, always curiosity. Women and men who navigate the boundaries of learning begin with a deep curiosity. They are interested in knowing something new, understanding the way something works, asking the probing questions, and seeking a new way of being in the world. The second step requires that they let go of the fear of the unknown, and the fear of failure. Conquering the fear is not done by some rational listing of pros and cons, or by some calculation of the benefits and the liabilities, but by deciding to take the audacious, in fact bodacious, leap of faith. Once we take the leap of faith, we face the possibility of failure and the probability, at least in the short run, of making fools of ourselves. Humor saves us. Losing the fear opens the way for step 3 of the Border Crossers' new learning, the willingness to be vulnerable, open, and exposed, to fail publicly, to experiment without embarrassment and humiliation. In fact, failure becomes one of our most important diagnostic tools for learning, and the best way to learn how we learn. Developing empathy is the fourth step that boundary crossers must master in learning something new and giving forward. We must be able to put ourselves in the place of those who are our teachers, those we are seeking to understand. We have a different perspective, who have a different perspective or a strange way of doing things. The final step, one that we can see most clearly in our rear view mirrors, is the recognition that new learning does not mean losing touch with life on the other side of the border. As a matter of fact, the work of the third chapter is integrative. we find ways of constructing something out of the disparate elements of our long lives, expanding our repertoires, and merging the old and the new into something whole and layered and deep. Says novelist Toni Morrison, who speaks from the outer edge of her third chapter, if not beyond. She says, the borders are our natural sites of creation, the places where we invent, transgress, and create. The borders are our natural sites of creation, the places where we invent, transgress, and create. And then my fourth and final lesson is on imagery and innovation. Giving forward should not only be seen as an individual pursuit, a solitary gesture of goodwill, an act of heroism by one brave soul. Fundamental social change will require a collective action, including challenging the negative, infantilizing cultural imagery that distorts the lives and identities of older adults. It will require changes in the public discourse and policies that offer us greater visibility and voice. And it will require major institutional innovations that allow for more access and opportunity. Currently, we are missing the necessary infrastructures that might effectively harness the action and the energy of those of us in our third chapters. Organizational redesign of other arenas of learning will have to allow for shifts in our routines and rhythms across our lifetimes, offering us multiple opportunities to recalibrate the balance between work and love, between work and family and community, and between work and play, all of which may help us revise and expand our definitions of a purposeful and meaningful life. Citing a confluence of changes in life expectancy, in developmental patterns, and in societal expectations, cultural historians Harry Moody and Thomas Cole call the third chapter a season in search of a purpose. A season in search of a purpose. What a perfect sentiment for this moment in our history and for this season of our lives. We in our third chapters can become pioneers of purpose, helping to lead the way to a new and compelling vision of later life, a vision that inspires and provokes all of us to find large and small ways, dramatic and subtle ways, extraordinary and ordinary ways to give forward. So inspired by the luminous narratives of our pioneers of purpose, in my book, in our neighborhoods, throughout our country, and across the world, let us go forth and look to the stars and lift up our voices. Let us go forth and with deep gladness meet the world's great hunger. Thank you very much.
Just to say that Sarah's book is really a part of an ancient tradition, which goes back actually thousands of years. The tracking of the ways in which there may be certain seasons of our life throughout the lifespan, which we think of as a relatively modern, late 20th century idea, is actually quite an ancient one. And you can go back to Confucius, who 2,500 years ago wrote about the way, he said, the 30s are for becoming firm in our purpose, the 40s for trying to become freer from doubt, the 50s to try to come to know our fate, the 60s are for coming to tell truth from falsehood by listening deeply to others. It's amazing that, 2,500 years ago, somebody was thinking about these particular kinds of seasons, a kind of natural curriculum to the lifespan. 1,500 years ago, in an old Jewish text called the Pirkei Avot, the Ethic of Our Fathers, You see similar kinds of ideas that the 20s are for the pursuit of one's aim in life, the 30s for developing strength, the 40s for developing insight, the 50s for giving counsel. So these are, you're actually standing in a very, very old tradition. And of course, we have our own, popular humor that in the 40s we learned that death is not optional, and we have to kind of deal with that. Somebody said in our 50s we have the face we deserve, and so on. So this is part of a very, very long tradition. The field of adult development is often described as kind of standing on two legs, and in a very interesting way, Sarah kind of bridges these two sources, the first of which is often referred to as the phase approach to thinking about adult development, that is, the ways in which age itself can be a powerful marker, and certainly see that reflected kind of in the title, in the way that you've demarked a certain space kind of these 25 years. And these ancient traditions kind of are reflective of that approach as well. But there's a second big tradition in the study of adulthood, which is not just about age alone, and is actually about a very old-fashioned idea, and that is the possibility of acquiring wisdom, that we don't just have new kinds of curricular kind of attentions that come up at given ages, taking up different kinds of tasks, but that we may actually be able to continue to grow and develop in adulthood, not just put on weight, And when I read, Sarah's book, you can even hear it in some of the stories that she shared with us this evening. These are stories very often of people who are really taking very courageous kinds of steps in the remaking of themselves as well as their lives, and stories where you can you get a feeling like the scientist whose kind of whole way of living and making sense was starting to kind of lose that vitality that she longed for, and this kind of capacity to begin to hold on to greater degrees of complexity and paradox, which was actually kind of first talked about by Carl Jung, as some of you may know, who was actually one of the first, long before Erickson, to talk about the possibilities of this age period as a time when we can begin, some people who are lucky enough and have good supports, can begin to grow into a new phase that permits, yes, this kind of generativity that you're talking about, that often involves being able to include parts of oneself that one has left out in the fashioning of a life structure and the joining of opposites. And Jung, talked about the way that some people in this period that you're writing about, that some men can discover the more feminine side of themselves that they've not been able to hold on to in earlier adulthood, and so projected, sort of onto women, and then got close to it, by their, relationships with women, and women getting closer to the more masculine side, but as well these other antinomies of the older person being able to recapture the child within the creative and the destructive forces sort of coming together. And I think many of the stories are actually about people in the process of recovering a new kind of vitality, also seeing things they couldn't see before, developing a kind of wisdom. And that brings me to my last thought, which is that Sarah's drawing our attention to something that's never happened before in human history. So many people living, say, even these additional 25 years. 100 years ago, most people, a lot of people were dead, in the 25 years between 50 and 75, right? We have an average life expectancy was in the 40s. It's a bit artifactual. There were some people that lived a lot longer and so on. But still, we know that we're living a whole generation longer. And that kind of raises the question, what might we generate having a whole additional generation to live? Or you could sort of put it this way, why are we living longer? Now, the glib answer to that question is the advances of medical science. But that's a very thin answer, and it's more about the means by which we are living longer. But you could step back just a bit further and ask, if you look at us as a species, why are we doing this? Why are we living a whole generation longer? Why are we living these additional 25 years? And the kind of thing that I think of when I read Sarah's book is that I'm talking about a kind of species wisdom, that we may be living these additional years in order to learn something that the species needs to learn in order for it to survive. That's what every species wants to do. We know we are living constantly between extraordinary advances and the possibilities of our being on the brink. And when I read, Sarah's book, I sort of, wonder whether or not we aren't getting a kind of picture of the sorts of things that we may need as a species to learn, which we can only learn in the years from 50 to 75. So I want to end, by saluting you for your own generativity and generosity, bringing us, not your lessons, but bringing us the lessons you learned from the people that you listen to so carefully. Thank you.
One of the things I talk about in the book is perceived abundance. That is, not all these people are millionaires. Not all these people are affluent or wealthy. They are, many of them, in fact, were born poor, working class, but they are people who at least have an idea that they have choices and alternatives and can make those, have some agency in making those. But still, it's true that most of the folks in that book are better educated and have more money than most of the folks in our society. And so I worried a little bit about that. And one of the things I've learned in the last 6 weeks since this book came out, I've learned from listening to stories of people who call into NPR stations. I've been perhaps on 12 or 15 NPR radio shows. Those are hour-long shows from Dallas or from Albany or from Madison, Wisconsin, or from wherever. And for the first half hour, I sit in my study, right, in what my grandmother used to call my dishables. I don't even have to get dressed, right, to listen to to listen to this. And then for the first half hour, some host who's read the book very carefully and is very perceptive and asks probing questions, asks about the book, and we have a good conversation. And then the airwaves are open, and people call in. And I've done this before, but I've never had this experience. The experience is that they call in and they say, "You're talking about me. You're talking about me," and then they begin to tell their stories. They don't ask me any questions. They are people from all walks of life. It's the factory worker in Michigan who was laid off from his job, a job that required welding, and began to take his stuff to the flea market every Saturday with his wife and kids to sell, right? Or to trade or to barter. And notice that there was some stuff that people called art there, right? That he thought, I can do that. I can do that. I have that in me. And he began using his welding skills to build these huge dinosaur sculptures made out of metal, right? And began to take them back to the flea market and sell them. Then he began to get a reputation for these big, big figures that were really interesting and exotic, and he began to sell them to galleries. In other words, he tells this story of this transformation. And then there's, the plumber who came to fix my dishwasher, a couple of weeks ago, who I must say has come much too often to fix my dishwasher. We've become friends, and he says, "Sarah, you'll never guess what I'm doing." This is the impulse to tell the story. I said, "What are you up to, Jack?" And he says, "I'm taking cooking lessons." And I say, "Oh my goodness," because this is a guy who comes from an Italian working class family, lives in the North End. His mother is the best cook in the North End. His wife is the second best cook in the North End. He's always wanted to, as he put it, get in the kitchen. Get in the kitchen. So he began to taking a cooking course, and he promised himself that after a year, and he began at 1 November, and then this last November, that he would he would ban the women from the kitchen, and he'd cook the entire, and I mean the entire, soup to nuts of Thanksgiving dinner, right? And he was very successful. But then what he says after that is, he says, you know, Sarah, he says, it's not just about cooking, it's not just about the kitchen. It's about feeding people. It's about nourishing people. And that was always left to women. You know, and this is what I've just found what Bob Keegan was talking about when he was talking about, you know, the men leaning towards the feminine there. And this is really all of the metaphors and all the things that he was talking about were that. So it's my sense, Andy, that that this is not a bunch of stories or experiences or perspectives that are owned by people who have money or who have education, who have affluence. There is an impulse at this time in our lives to find some new way, to discover something new about ourselves, you know, to reinvest in something. And there are stories upon stories coming through those airways of people stopping on the highway, getting out of their cars, getting me on the cell phone, and saying, you're talking about me. Is that there is opportunity in the university for intergenerational discourse. That one of the ways in which I'm always pushed and prodded and challenged is, first of all, by my students, right? Who bring with them the currency of the contemporary discourse. They are on the edge of the culture, and they're telling me the ways in which I might be nostalgic, anachronistic, not cool, not with it, all of that. But I also think within the academy, across generations of faculty, that there need to be more opportunities for people who are beginning and people who are moving along to have conversations, not only about their fields, within their fields, but across fields. Because I think one of the very exciting things about being in the third chapter is this integrative aspect of it, is the chance to really bring together so many aspects of your experience and discover others, and weave something new into a new intellectual reality for yourself. So I think that's another place. I remember several years ago here teaching a junior faculty seminar and feeling, I must say, in that space, a new kind of energy and challenge to my own way of thinking about things. And if we could sort of design and create more opportunities for that kind of forum, I think that would be helpful as well. I think just one last thing that I always find energizing is to watch our colleagues teach. In other words, have the opportunity. We're beginning to do that here at the Graduate School of Education, is visit other colleagues' classrooms and watch them teach. Because again, it's about expanding our repertoire, our ways of knowing, our ways of explaining, our ways of questioning. And I think that too inspires us to keep moving and to keep reinventing ourselves. Well, I think that a lovely scenario that many of us participated in was this last campaign, and particularly Obama's campaign, where young and middle-aged and old people were all together on a common project, and where some of the things that young people knew, we needed to know, and we needed to listen to, and we needed to follow. I was canvassing in the southwestern part of New Hampshire, and my partner for 3 times running was a 24-year-old graduate student at Dartmouth, who was a very aggressive, energetic, speedy, somewhat, from my point of view, abrasive questioner. And he would always say, spit it out, Sarah, spit it out, like that. But he had all the facts, he had all the figures, he had all the energy. So I had a bunch to learn from him. But I was trying to get him to learn how to listen. I was trying to get him to be patient. I was trying to get him to be empathic with these views that we could hardly bear to hear. And this was this wonderful tug of war, tension between us as we discovered what the other knew and what was useful for each of us to learn. And that came because we were engaged in a common project that we cared so deeply about, and we wanted to work together to change the world. And I think there's a pot there that it isn't only sitting next to another person having a conversation, but it is about being engaged in working together towards something that you both believe in. And I think those interactions can happen not only in that kind of campaign, but in mentoring programs, in apprenticeship programs. I just watched a beautiful a doctor training some residents recently, and I was really struck with this kind of conversation that both reflected the energy, optimism, and idealization and cynicism of the younger residents, and this wise, patient, again, somewhat cynical older person, and those conversations coming together. Well, I think that I didn't expect this to be such a risky business. I didn't expect it to be so hard. I mean, this is really not that suddenly someone sees the light and is inspired and moves forward and free at last and liberated to the next level. This is incremental. This is difficult. They're 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. It's hard. You feel vulnerable. So there are all kinds of things that make it a real big challenge. And it is a lonely challenge. In other words, I think most people going through it don't experience it as being something that a whole kind of generation of people might be engaged in. So that it feels as if there's not a whole lot of support for it. I think one of the reasons that I really wanted to write this book is so that people wouldn't feel so lonely in it, so that wouldn't be there. The other thing that I think felt really important and profound is that there is a real difference in thinking about this as a 3rd chapter rather than as the last chapter. And this is, I think, Bob Keegan was referring to this earlier, that's really interesting and really important. Because if we think of it as the 3rd chapter, and we hope another one to come, then we really are challenged to do something with it, to make meaning out of it, to be purposeful. And I think that I feel that even I feel it in my body as well. I want to be stronger. I want to be more beautiful. I want to be more colorful, right? All those things that allow me to experience this as new and challenging and focused on change. And I think that was surprising to me, too, that it's so different from thinking about this being the last chapter. I remember about 20 years ago when my mother, who's now 94, and who lives on her own, as she would put it, not alone, but on her own, at the homestead where we grew up, called all 3 of her children, middle-aged, all of us, early middle-aged, in our early 40s, to the homestead, and she wanted to have a conversation, an important conversation with us. So we sat around the dining room table. Now, at this point, I'm thinking of my mother as old. She was 72. And she said to us that she wanted to talk to us because she wanted us to know her in the way she is now, know her as a 72-year-old woman, that she felt as if her children didn't really know who she was. We knew who she was back somewhere when, but we had gotten stuck in that place in our view of who she was. And so she was inviting us, demanding, as a matter of fact, that we get to know her. And I remember the response to that for me was defensive and surprised, because she has 3 children. All of us are attentive. We're good listeners. We have the empathic gene. And we care deeply for her. And besides that, I had spent just 3 years earlier, 3 years, doing a research project that ended up in a biography that I wrote about my mother. How much did I have to know about her? But I was struck I was struck with, at that moment, I remember, I'm sure that was the germ of this book. The germ was to realize that, learning and needing to be known, reinventing yourself and needing to be known continues on and on and on. And that's particularly important with those people most precious to us, those people who love us and who are supporting us. And I think that was sort of the inspiration for thinking about this period of life as being one in which we not only are learning and reinventing ourselves and becoming, but we are also wanting to be known in a way that's current, that's in the now, that's in the existential present. And she has not stopped asking to be known, and she continues to change. So it's clear that, that fourth chapter learners, fourth chapter people continue on. Actually, you shouldn't be embarrassed at all, because as I've gone around talking about this book, usually someone shoots up, and it's a he always, at least so far. He's tall, he's dark, he's handsome, he's silver-haired, he's gorgeous, he's strong. He's run 5 miles that morning. He says, I'm 85. What about me? In other words, it's clear that it is at least more of the same, But I would imagine that it's even riskier, that you can be even more irreverent, that you can laugh at yourself even more, I imagine that there's no reason to be cautious at all in the fourth chapter. But I haven't studied it. That's just my hope. Oh, that's so sweet and loving. I really do believe that any parent would love to have a child ask a question that says, tell me the story. Tell me the story about who you are, who you have been, and who you hope to become. It's just a total aphrodisiac as far as I'm concerned. And it is, I think Bob was saying this too about the child in us coming out, but I think the wonderful thing about children is that they are storytellers, and the question, they're always sort of saying, so then what happened? They want to hear the story. So then what happened? So how did it turn out? So where did he go? And what became of that one? That's the question that a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old asks about life. And I think that to have that come back to you as a mother, as a father, from a child, about your own life, I can't imagine any adult resisting that. Now, I do think that there are ways in which, if in fact you're not just being curious and loving, but if you're trying to somewhat, in some ways, uncover something that's been masked and hidden, some early injury or some scar or some big secret, that's a different kind of conversation. And I think that has to be done with more patience and more caution, and you have to figure out yourself as a young adult why it is you want to know it and to whom it will be helpful. It's very interesting. One of the things which at least I heard, and this is not a finding, and I didn't count those, but my sense was that many of the men who I spoke to were interested in finding ways of nourishing and building their relationships with others, and even with other men. Something beyond the marital relationship, something beyond their children, something beyond the guy-buddy thing that happens wherever it happens. I don't know, because I'm not there. But doesn't feel like deep and nourishing friendship. And so I think this impulse to create relationships that are more sustaining, that are more supportive, that offer more opportunities to tell your story and to hear others in a trusting, respectful, and deepening way. I think that's something which is a yearning more for men at this age than for women, who have, I think, for the most part, had more opportunity to develop those relationships, or taken the opportunity to develop those relationships more. But I think that reaching out for friendship is one of the boundary crossings that I didn't mention, but a very good one. First of all, I don't really know the answer to that, because I spent my time talking to people who were engaged in moving forward, who were engaged in trying to push forward towards generativity in the way Erickson speaks about it. But I must say I talked to people for whom this was a struggle and for whom these steps were incremental, and who experienced often huge frustration at what they were experiencing, and moments of regression as they thought they had moved forward and then were pulled back, and lots of fear and lots of anxiety about it. And I remember one woman in particular talking about feeling it in her body as she tried to move forward and just couldn't figure out a way of doing it. And she talked about feeling hollow. And she knew that until she was able to cross that, what she called the great abyss, she would continue to feel hollow. Now, I also think that, maybe this is apocryphal, but I do think that there must be people out there who could play golf every day and be perfectly happy in their third chapters. There are people, in other words, I don't think, again, that these stories need to look dramatic or ambitious or poetic or passionate. They can, I think, be quite flat and smooth and ordinary. And not that I've seen this or talked to people about this, it would be interesting, but I don't want to put that down because I don't know what the subtext of that life is. I don't know what the invisible kind of river is that's flowing there, if there is one. I just have no idea. But I wouldn't want to say that these people I wouldn't necessarily want to say the harsh option is stagnation. And I don't know, I also think that this sort of view that's just a largely chronological one, which talks about development in these age ways, 50 to 75, may not be the place where these people are shining or moving or becoming or exploring. I do think that there's great value in hearing the stories of others who are doing something different. And I can see that that can be a ripple, that can be catchy. You're sitting around a table and someone tells you something outrageous that they're doing. You say, you're not doing that. I don't think you can do that. And somehow the energy begins to flow among folks, and they inspire one another to take a step they never imagined in their wildest dreams that they would ever take. But to label a person stagnant seems to me not part of my ethical, apparently my ethical tradition. Learning this, and you talk to them about it, and you ask impertinent and probing questions, and you observe a lot of the things that that people were talking about, what we're doing in their new learning, they couldn't talk about, right? In other words, they couldn't find words for. So it required that I observe them and be there and witness what was going on, and then ask them questions about it. And then when I would finish talking to them, I would say, do you happen to know anyone else, anywhere, who's doing some things that are interesting in terms of new learning? And I began to gather names like that and talk to people over time.